It started with the feeling that the silence wasn't empty, but full. I was home alone for the first time in years. My parents had gone on a weekend trip to visit a sick relative, leaving me, a 23-year-old, with a full-time desk job, in charge of a house that had been my entire world since I was a child. The first night, a Friday, was blissful. I ordered a pizza, played video games until my eyes blurred, and enjoyed the freedom of not having to tiptoe around. The house, an old 2-story colonial with creaky floorboards and temperamental plumbing, was a familiar friend. Every groan of the heating system, every tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, knew them all. They were the comforting soundtrack to my life. But that second night, a Saturday, the soundtrack changed. I was scrolling through my phone in the living room when I heard a sound from outside, not a branch scraping the window, not an animal. It was a single, soft rap on the glass of the kitchen window, sharp and distinct, like a knuckle. I froze, my thumb hovering over the screen. It was too soft to be a prank, too deliberate to be accidental. It was just one knock, then nothing. A wave of cold washed over me, a feeling of being observed, and I pulled the curtains shut, telling myself it was nothing, just a trick of the old house. That feeling, that subtle shift from comfort to unease, was the beginning of everything. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that the suburban sprawl was hardly a hotbed for home invasions. And besides, I was a light sleeper. The hours passed, and I managed to get my mind off it by focusing on the mundane. I went to the kitchen to get a drink of water. The tap squeaked, and the sound echoed unnaturally in the quiet. I turned on the light and glanced at the window. The curtains still drawn. A chill ran down my spine. The single knock had felt like a question, and now the silence felt like the space where I was supposed to provide an answer. But I had nothing to say. I finished my drink and made my way upstairs. As I passed the master bedroom, which was my parents' room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered closing it earlier that day when I was tidying up. I always closed it. It was just a habit. I told myself a gust of wind from an open window had pushed it, but all the windows were shut tight. I reached out and pushed the door firmly closed, the click of the latch echoing in the silent hallway. I went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, listening to the house breathe. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Below, a faint, constant tone. And then, woven into that familiar hum, was a new sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Not the single knock from before, but a slow, steady tap-tap, coming from what sounded like the other side of the house, where the guest room was. It was too quiet to be certain, almost lost in the background noise, but it was there, and it was persistent. I finally got up, heart pounding. My parents had told me to check on a few things before they left, including the old boiler in the basement. I'd been putting it off. Maybe it was a pipe. I crept out of my room, my bare feet silent on the worn carpet. I made my way to the guest room and pressed my ear to the door. The tapping was gone. Just silence. It was then I saw it. On the carpet, just outside the closed door, was a single, small, brown leaf. We lived in a neighborhood with no trees that dropped those kind of leaves. There was no explanation for it being there, especially not when the house was sealed up. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. The tapping began again, this time from the hallway behind me. It was quick, insistent, and seemed to be moving. My breath caught in my throat. I turned and saw nothing but the long, dark hallway. The tapping stopped. I ran back into my room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I leaned against it, my eyes scanning the room as if something was already in here with me. It was irrational, I knew, but every shadow felt like a waiting shape. I stayed there for what felt like an hour, my body a coiled spring of tension, before I heard it again. This time it was distinct and terrifyingly close. It was a scratching sound, coming from inside my closet. A slow, deliberate scraping of something sharp against wood. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was a methodical, almost artistic scraping, like a claw drawing lines on the back of the closet door. I could hear my own heart thudding in my ears, and the sound was so loud it drowned out everything else. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and grabbed my phone. I dialed 911, my voice a strangled whisper as I tried to explain what was happening. I was huddled in the far corner of my room, holding the phone tightly against my ear, listening to the dispatcher's calm voice. The scratching had stopped. The house was silent again, a deep, heavy quiet that was worse than the noise. The dispatcher was telling me to stay calm, that an officer was on the way. I heard something from the other side of my bedroom door. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling. The feeling of something breathing. It was a soft, wet inhalation and exhalation, just on the other side of the door. Then, the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, silently. It twisted to the left, a little at a time, until I heard the faint click of the lock disengaging. I stared, transfixed, at the knob as it began to turn back. There was a pause. The breathing stopped. Then, a voice, a whisper that was not a whisper, but a breathy, distorted, wet sound that came from right outside the door, right where I knew something was. It was a low, inhuman rattle, and it said my name, not in a question, not in a greeting. It was a statement. Just my name, drawn out, and wrong. It was the sound of something knowing me. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. They found nothing. No footprints in the grass. No signs of forced entry. The scratches on the inside of my closet door were gone. They checked the whole house, finding everything in its place. The guest room door was firmly closed. The master bedroom door was also shut. The officer looked at me with an expression of polite skepticism, suggesting it was probably just my imagination running wild in a big, old house. I didn't try to explain the whisper. I didn't tell him that the scratches had been on the inside of the closet. I moved out of that house a month later. I told my parents it was for a change of scenery. I still jump at every unusual sound and sleep with a lamp on, no matter how tired I am. But what keeps me up at night isn't the memory of the tapping, or the scratches, or even the feeling of being watched. It's the thought that whatever was in that house didn't just want to scare me. It wanted me to know that it knew who I was. It wanted me to know that it had my name. The worst thing about true isolation isn't the loneliness. It's the realization that you're not supposed to be alone. I've spent the last 6 years as a solo technician at a remote meteorological station in the Alaskan tundra. A tiny outpost surrounded by nothing but snow and sky. My shifts last for 2 weeks at a time, and the solitude is the main perk of the job. I love the silence, the vast, white emptiness that stretches to the horizon, the feeling of being the only human for 100 miles. My only constant companions are the wind and the static from the long-range radio. It was a cold, clear night, the kind where the stars burn with an impossible intensity, and I was making my final log entries. The radio, which usually only carried the occasional clipped report from another station, or the distant, garbled music of a faraway channel, was silent. Then, a low hum bled through the static. Not the usual white noise. It sounded like a voice, stretched thin and distorted, but there was a rhythm to it. I leaned closer, adjusting the dial. It wasn't a weather report or a message. It was a single, repetitive sound, and I swear, through the static and the hum, I could make out my name. It was just a whisper, a breathy sound that came and went. John, John, John. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was gone, swallowed by the static again. My blood ran cold, but I shook it off. This was my 6th year. I knew all about atmospheric interference, strange signals, and the way the cold played tricks on the electronics. I told myself it was just a strange frequency. It was a technical glitch. It was nothing. But my hand stayed on the dial, and I couldn't stop listening. The feeling of nothing didn't last. A few hours after the first incident, the weather took a turn. A storm was coming in, a real whiteout that would keep me isolated for at least another few days. The wind began to howl, a deep, mournful sound that rattled the reinforced windows. I was preparing to hunker down when the radio hummed to life again. This time, it wasn't my name. It was a strange, rhythmic chant. It was low, guttural, and sounded like a language I'd never heard before. But it was being spoken right there, in the small warm room with me. I turned the volume down until it was a faint whisper, but I couldn't turn it off. I was transfixed, listening to the strange alien words being carried on the airwaves, all while the wind screamed outside. I tried to use the satellite phone to call my supervisor, to report the strange interference, but all I got was a constant, flat tone. The line was dead. I looked at the station's external cameras, the ones that monitored the perimeter. The camera feed showed the swirling snow, the darkness, the endless white nothing. Then, for a split second, a flicker, a shape moved across the top right corner of the frame. It was fast, almost too fast to see. I rewound the feed, frame by frame, but it was gone. Just a blur, a smudge in the pixelated snow. I told myself it was a gust of wind, a piece of debris, or a malfunctioning camera. But then the feed flickered again. This time, it was a shadow, long and thin, that passed over the lens. It was moving too fast to be human, and too unnatural to be a known animal. There are no trees out here, no poles tall enough to cast a shadow. Like that. I sat there for hours, watching the cameras, my heart pounding in my chest. The chants from the radio continued, growing louder and more insistent. It felt like they were getting closer, the voices weaving a web of sound around the station, around me. The thought that whatever was broadcasting these sounds wasn't just a signal, but something that was out there in the cold, something that was aware of me, began to take hold. I saw another flicker on the camera feed, and this time, my rationale, mine broke. I ran to the main control panel and manually cut the feed to the cameras. The silence from the radio was a relief, but the deep, howling wind that rushed in to fill the void was even worse. The sense of being watched from the vast, white emptiness outside was now a tangible pressure against the walls. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the horizon, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening. Through the swirling snow, I saw it, a shape, standing motionless on a distant ridge. It was tall and impossibly thin, a silhouette that seemed to absorb the light. It wasn't a rock, because it was too regular, too symmetrical. And it wasn't a human, because of the way its limbs bent at impossible angles, like shattered glass. I watched it for what felt like an eternity, and it never moved. It just stood there, a still, black monument, against the storm, facing me. It was looking right at me. The blizzard was at its peak. The entire station was shaking under the force of the wind, and the windows were caked in ice. I had abandoned the binoculars, and I was huddled in the kitchen, a hot cup of coffee my only source of warmth. My mind was racing, trying to find a rational explanation. The figure on the ridge, the radio chants, the dead communication lines. It had to be a hallucination. The isolation was finally getting to me. Then, a low thud came from the opposite side of the station, from the reinforced window that faced north. I froze. It was a single, heavy thud, like a large body hitting the glass. I crept over to the window, my legs heavy with dread. I wiped the ice from the corner of the glass and peered out into the white vortex of the storm. Nothing, just swirling, snow and darkness. I sighed in relief, the release of tension leaving me weak. And then, another thud. This one came from the window I was just at. I spun around, my heart in my throat. I pressed my face to the glass, and through the swirling chaos, I saw it. The figure from the ridge. It was standing right outside the window, not 5 feet away. It was tall, thin, and its arms hung by its sides, bending in ways that no human arms should bend. Its head was small, and it had no discernible features, just a blackness against the white, and it was staring right at me, right at my face, through the glass. The wind was screaming, a sound that filled the world, but somehow I heard something else, a whisper, not from the radio, not from the wind. It was coming from a place beyond sound, a place deep in my mind, and it was saying the same thing the radio had been trying to tell me all along. "You're not alone," it said. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the thing outside my window, but it was gone when the storm finally broke. The rescue team arrived the next morning. They found me in a state of catatonic shock, wrapped in a blanket in a corner, my coffee long since gone cold. They wrote it off as cabin fever and the mental toll of extreme isolation. I never went back to that job. I live in a city now, surrounded by people and noise and light. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, late at night, I'll turn on the TV, and when the static comes on, I'll listen. And sometimes, buried in the low white noise, I'll hear it again. That low, rhythmic sound, that voice that knows my name. And I'll remember the thing that was standing outside my window, just waiting for the static to clear. Taps on the wall. I waited, my breath held. The tapping from my neighbor's side immediately stopped. The scraping, however, grew louder, more violent. It was moving up the wall, a slow, methodical climbing sound, punctuated by a series of low, wet thuds. The sound was so close that it felt like it was inside my own room. It was not a conversation I wanted to be a part of. The scraping continued for what felt like an eternity, tracing a path along the wall, directly above my head. It stopped just above my bed, and for the first time, I heard another sound. It was a soft, guttural sniffing, followed by a faint clicking noise, like a tongue against the roof of a mouth. The wall, old and frail, was no longer a barrier. It was a membrane. I spent the next night in my bed, a blanket pulled over my head, too afraid to move. The scraping was still there, but it was now a low, persistent gnawing, right above me, a constant reminder of what was lurking on the other side. My neighbor's tapping had completely ceased. The silence from his apartment was now a terrifying void. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the tapping had been a desperate attempt to warn me, and that it had failed. The gnawing stopped. I held my breath, listening to the deep, heavy silence of the apartment. I heard a soft rustling sound from the corner of my room, near an old painted-over air vent. It was a small oblong vent that had been sealed shut with several layers of paint. A low, wet sucking sound followed the rustling, and then the painted vent cover began to move. Slowly, with an unnerving creak, it began to be pushed outwards, the brittle paint cracking and flaking away. A long, thin, unnaturally pale finger emerged from the opening. It was followed by another, and then another, each one pale and thin and bending at odd, impossible joints. The fingers felt around the rim of the vent, testing the air, and then they slowly began to pull themselves out, their knuckles clicking and popping with a sickening sound. The tapping had been the neighbor trying to warn me. The scratching had been the thing in my walls. The silence from his apartment was because it was no longer on the other side of the wall. It was now in my room. I left the apartment that night, without looking back. I told the landlord that I was moving out and never gave a reason. I tried to find my neighbor, to thank him, to apologize for not listening, but his apartment was empty. The landlord told me that the previous tenant had moved out a month ago, and the unit had been vacant ever since. My skin still crawls when I think about it. I now live in a modern building with thick, concrete walls, but I still can't shake the feeling. I sleep with the lights on, the television blaring, and the sound of my phone or the radio always there, to cover the silence. I am forever listening for a pattern, a message in the noise. I'm waiting for the tapping. I'm afraid to find out what happens when the tapping stops and the scratching begins again. I've always been a creature of the night. My job as a freelance graphic designer meant my hours were my own, and I found the deep quiet of 2 a.m. to be the most productive time. My apartment was a cheap, drafty one-bedroom in an old brick building, but it had large windows, and the rent was low. The thin walls were a given, a trade-off I made for the peace I sought. For the first year, I considered my neighbor a quiet man I only ever saw in passing, a silent partner in this nocturnal existence. I would hear the distant hum of his television, the muffled thump of his footsteps, and it was a comfort, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in the world. The sounds of life from the other side of the shared wall were a familiar, calming presence. But that changed on one particularly quiet Tuesday night. I was focused on a project, the only sound in the room being the soft click of my mouse, when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Tap tap, pause, tap tap. It came from the other side of the wall, from my neighbor's apartment. It wasn't loud, just a persistent, almost polite sound. I figured he was building something or hanging a picture late at night. I didn't think much of it at the time, just made a mental note of the new, late-night noise. That was my first mistake. My second was listening for it the next night. The tapping came again the following evening, but it was different. It wasn't the sound of someone working. It was a complex, almost melodic pattern. 3 fast taps, a pause, 2 slow ones. It was insistent, like a code. My own work, which had been so easy to get lost in, was now completely forgotten. My ears were pressed to the thin wall, my mind trying to make sense of the new rhythm. The tapping went on for about 15 minutes, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and unnerving. I was about to go back to my work when I heard a new sound, coming from my side of the wall. It was a low, scraping sound, a soft skr-skr, as if someone were running a fingernail along the inside of the plaster. It came from the corner where my bookshelf was, right where the wall met the floor. I pulled the bookshelf away, but there was nothing there, just the old, peeling wallpaper and a thin baseboard. The scraping stopped. I stood there, utterly confused, my heart thumping against my ribs. I knew the building was old, but these noises were new, specific, and seemingly responsive. The next few nights, the patterns escalated. The tapping from my neighbor's side of the wall became more frantic, more erratic. It was no longer a code. It was a desperate plea. The scraping from my side of the wall became more aggressive, a harsh, grating sound that seemed to be directly answering the tapping. It was a conversation, I realized. The tapping and the scratching were communicating. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I could feel the tone of the exchange. The tapping was a warning, a frantic shout. The scraping was a slow, deliberate, and terrifying response. I was losing sleep. My work was piling up. I was spending all my nights with my ear pressed to the wall, trying to decipher the message, trying to understand what my neighbor was so desperately trying to tell me. One night, in a fit of paranoia, I tapped back. Just 3 slow. Branches creaking like old bones. I heard a sound from outside the tent. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, scraping sound, as if something heavy was being dragged across the forest floor. I held my breath, my entire body tense. The sound stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining in the dark, and then it started again, this time from a different direction, closer to the tent. It was followed by a series of thuds, a slow, methodical rhythm that was impossible to mistake. It was the sound of something dropping a heavy stone. One, then another, then another. The scraping and the thudding continued, a slow, deliberate cadence, as if something was painstakingly building one of those strange cairns right outside my tent. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen with a primal, suffocating fear. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't a person. The thudding and scraping went on for hours, a relentless, horrifying symphony being performed just feet from where I lay. I could hear the distinct sound of a rock scraping against another, the tiny muffled clink of them settling into place. Then, a new sound, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. It was low and inhuman, a mournful, ancient sound that seemed to be coming from the center of the growing cairn. The hum filled the air, a sound of immense power and cold, alien purpose. It went on, a single, unwavering tone that felt like a question, a plea, or a demand. I felt it in my chest, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. The humming, the scraping, the thudding, it was a message being delivered, and I was the unwilling recipient. The humming and the scraping stopped abruptly as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. I lay there for a long time, listening to the birds chirp, the creek gurgle, the normal sounds of a waking forest. Slowly, cautiously, I unzipped my tent. My eyes immediately fell upon it. Not 10 feet from my tent door, where my fire had been just hours before, stood a cairn of stones at least 5 feet high. It was a massive, impossibly balanced tower of rock, with the largest stones at the base and the smallest at the top. The precision was breathtaking, and the sheer number of stones was staggering. I looked around for footprints, for any sign of a person, but there were none. The ground was soft and muddy from the creek, but there was nothing, only a single, strange, 3-toed footprint near the base of the cairn. I didn't stop to take a picture. I didn't stop to pack up my gear properly. I shoved everything into my backpack, abandoned my tent, and ran. I ran down the trail, not stopping until I saw the road, not stopping until I was back in my car, and the sound of the engine was a blessed relief. I never went back to that part of the park. I still hike, but I never go alone, and I never, ever, venture off the main trails. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear it. The low, resonant hum, the sound of a question asked by something ancient and patient. Something that was building a message for me in the middle of a forest, a message I was never meant to understand. I've been backpacking for a decade, and I consider myself an expert on the art of getting lost. Not literally, of course, but the kind of getting lost that happens when you're deep in the wilderness, away from civilization, where the only thing that matters is the trail beneath your feet and the sky above your head. This trip was supposed to be a week-long solo journey through the Cascade National Forest, a place known for its ancient trees and rugged, forgotten trails. On my third day and miles from the nearest road, I came across something that shouldn't have been there. It was a small pile of stones, stacked one on top of the other, forming a perfectly balanced, conical shape. A cairn. While cairns aren't unheard of on hiking trails, this one was different. It wasn't haphazardly built. The stones were flat and smooth, stacked with a kind of precision that felt deliberate, almost unnatural. It was in the middle of a barely used trail, and I knew for a fact that no other hikers had been this far out in weeks. I took a picture of it, thinking it was a strange piece of trail art, an odd marker left by a fellow loner. I continued on, my way, but a little seed of unease had been planted, a feeling that I was no longer alone in the quiet wilderness. The forest itself, was a tapestry of greens and browns, a beautiful, serene landscape. The air was clean, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. My camp for that night was a small clearing next to a winding creek, a spot I had visited on previous trips. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and made dinner. The solitude I had craved was now tinged with the memory of that strange stone cairn. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I went to collect more firewood. I walked a little ways off the trail, deeper into the thick trees, and that's when I saw the second one. Another cairn, this one slightly larger, stood in the center of a small, open space between two massive Douglas firs. The stones were different, a collection of dark, moss-covered rocks, but the shape was the same, a perfectly conical tower, defying gravity. A cold dread seeped into my bones. This wasn't a prank. It felt like a message. I hurried back to my campsite, my heart thudding in my chest, and started listening to the sounds of the forest in a new way. The rustle of a leaf, the snapping of a twig, the chattering of a squirrel. They no longer sounded like the comforting music of nature. They sounded like a presence, a watchful eye waiting just beyond the tree line. As night fell, I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that the solitude and the strange cairns were playing tricks on my mind, but the feeling of being watched intensified. My senses were on high alert. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound felt like a footstep. I decided to pack up in the morning and hike back to my car, cutting my trip short. But the fear had already taken root. The night deepened, and I was huddled inside my sleeping bag, my headlamp still on, the fire outside a dying ember. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and groan. They're ancient. The lake was our annual ritual. Every summer, my two best friends, Marc and Sarah, and I would pack up the car and head to a secluded but well-known campsite by Lake Serene. It was our escape from the city, a chance to fish, drink, and tell stories around a fire until we passed out. The first day was always a perfect blur of laughter and setup. This year, though, as we started to clear the campsite, we found something unsettling. Sitting on a felled log, right where we usually put our cooler, was a small, crudely carved wooden doll. It was made of a dark, weathered wood, and its features were rough and primitive. The most disturbing part, however, was its eyes. They had been gouged out, leaving two dark, empty holes staring blankly ahead. Marc, ever the jokester, picked it up with a stick. "Looks like a souvenir from the last campers," he said, laughing. "Probably a bad joke." Sarah shuddered and told him to throw it away. Marc did, tossing it into the dense undergrowth at the edge of the campsite. We all laughed about it, dismissing it as a weird, harmless prank. We never considered that it might have been left there for a reason, or that we were now standing in the middle of a story that didn't belong to us. As the sun set and the fire roared to life, the easy, carefree atmosphere began to shift. The crickets, which had been a constant, gentle backdrop to our day, seemed to fall silent. The wind, which had been a soft breeze, stilled to nothing. An unnatural quiet settled over the woods. We were used to the sounds of the night, the hooting of owls, the rustling of squirrels, but this silence was different. It felt heavy, expectant. The quiet was only broken by a strange, faint humming sound that seemed to drift from the opposite side of the lake. It was a distorted melody, like a child's nursery rhyme being sung just out of earshot, stretched and warped by the distance. We wrote it off as another group of campers, an assumption we desperately wanted to be true. But as we sat around the fire, Marc swore he saw the wooden doll from earlier sitting on a log across the camp. When we all looked, it was gone, just a play of firelight and shadow. We laughed again, but this time, the laughter was forced, a thin veil over our growing unease. That's when we realized that our things were starting to go missing. First it was Sarah's lighter, which she distinctly remembered putting on the cooler. Then, my pocket knife, which I had placed next to my tent. We started blaming each other, the casual joking turning into genuine frustration and suspicion. Marc, irritated, went to the edge of the campsite to search for the missing items. He returned a few minutes later, pale and silent. He found them all, he said. All our missing items, neatly arranged in a circle at the very spot where he had thrown the doll earlier that day. A chilling wave of dread washed over us all. This was no prank. This was deliberate. And then, we heard it. A slow, gentle, rhythmic tapping against the nylon of my tent. It wasn't loud, just a steady tap tap tap, coming from the side of the tent where no one was standing. It was a patient, insistent sound, and it continued for what felt like an eternity, a steady beat in the oppressive silence. I tried to convince myself it was just a branch tapping against the tent, but the rhythm was too perfect, too deliberate. We all sat there, staring into the darkness. Our fire, the only beacon of light in a world that had suddenly become foreign and hostile. The humming from the lake grew louder, closer. It was no longer a distorted melody. It was a high, childlike voice, singing a simple, innocent song, a lullaby, and it was coming from the darkness beyond the reach of our firelight. The humming got closer, the childlike voice now a haunting presence at the edge of our campsite. The tapping on my tent had stopped, but now we heard a new sound, a soft, scraping noise, like a stick being dragged across the ground, moving slowly in a circle around our campsite, outside the reach of the firelight. It was deliberate, methodical, and it felt like whatever was out there was drawing a line, a boundary between us and the woods. Marc, in a fit of terror, screamed and pointed into the darkness beyond the fire. "Did you see that?" he yelled, his voice cracking. We all looked, our eyes straining to make sense of the flickering shadows. We saw nothing, just the silhouettes of the ancient trees, their branches swaying in a non-existent breeze. But as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw something else. Something that made my blood run cold and my heart stop in my chest. The wooden doll. It wasn't sitting on a log. It wasn't in the dirt. It was standing upright, a dark, grotesque silhouette against the pale moonlight. Its head cocked to the side, as if it were listening to our every word, our every terrified breath. It had no eyes, but I could feel its gaze on me. It was standing at the very edge of the circle of our firelight, just a few feet from where Marc was sitting. We didn't sleep that night. We huddled together by the fire, our eyes fixed on the darkness, our ears straining for the slightest sound. The doll was gone by morning, as was the silence and the humming. The woods were filled with the familiar sounds of birds and the gentle lapping of the lake. We packed up our things in a terrified frenzy, leaving behind a few items we were too scared to search for. We didn't stop until we were back on the main road, the feeling of escape finally starting to settle over us. I tried to report what had happened to the local park ranger, an old man who had worked at the station for decades. He listened patiently to my rambling, terrified account, then told me a story of his own. A little girl, he said, had gone missing in those woods almost 70 years ago. She was never found, but she was known for her love of handmade wooden dolls. He said campers sometimes reported seeing strange things or finding dolls in their campsites, but they always disappeared by morning. He looked at me with a weary sadness. "Some things," he said, "don't ever leave the woods, son." I never went back to that lake. But I can't shake the image of that doll standing upright in the darkness, and the terrible thought that some stories don't end. They just wait for new people to find them. And I knew that whatever was in that river, it wasn't a hiker, and it wasn't a trick of the acoustics. It was a presence, and it wanted me. As the night wore on, the singing grew to a fever pitch, a deafeningly loud and beautiful melody that seemed to be coming from every direction at once. The fire was a small, flickering beacon in a sea of sound and darkness. I gave up on staying awake and crawled into my tent, zipping the flap shut, the thin nylon a pathetic barrier against the night. The singing was so loud that it felt like it was inside the tent with me, a chorus of voices rising and falling in an ancient otherworldly song. I covered my ears, but it did nothing. The sound was in my head, a hypnotic, beautiful nightmare that I couldn't escape. Then, I heard a different sound. A loud, heavy splash from the river, the sound of something massive hitting the water. The singing stopped abruptly. My heart stopped with it. The silence that followed was heavy and expectant, filled only with the sound of my own panicked breathing. Then, I heard it. A soft, wet scraping sound, a heavy, dragging noise coming from the direction of the river. It sounded like something large and heavy was pulling itself out of the water and onto the rocky shore. I heard a series of heavy thuds, a deliberate, dragging sound that was getting closer and closer to my tent. My body was a block of ice, my mind screaming at me to run, but my muscles refused to obey. The dragging stopped just outside my tent flap, inches from where my head was resting on my sleeping bag. A new sound started, a slow, wet, clicking and hissing, as if something were tasting the air, a sound of anticipation. It was a sound that was so close, so intimate, that I felt a gust of cold, wet air on the side of my face, through the thin fabric of my tent. The hissing was followed by a wet, whispered breath, and then a low, wet gurgling. It was a sound of immense satisfaction, and I knew that whatever was outside my tent, it had me. I don't know how I survived that night. I just lay there, frozen with terror, until the first rays of dawn touched the canyon walls. The hissing was gone. The river was back to its gentle gurgle. I slowly, cautiously, unzipped my tent. The morning light was a blessed relief, but it revealed something that made the dread return in a suffocating wave. On the ground outside my tent, in a perfectly circular pattern, were dozens of small, wet, smooth river stones. There were no footprints in the wet sand, no sign of anything heavy being dragged across the ground. There was nothing. I packed up my belongings in a daze, leaving my tent and my camping gear behind. I didn't stop to think. I hiked out of that canyon as fast as my legs could carry me, not looking back. I still hear the song sometimes, in my dreams, a beautiful, terrifying lullaby that lures me towards the sound of a cold, flowing river. I still hear the wet gurgling sound in the back of my mind, and I know, with a certainty that haunts my every waking moment, that the singing was a lure, and I was the prey, and that the thing in the river is still waiting for someone to answer its song. The thing about camping in a deep ravine is that the sounds of the night are amplified, distorted, and played on repeat. I've been a solo camper for years, and my favorite spot was a small, secluded patch of land nestled at the bottom of a river gorge, miles from the nearest trail. The river was a constant presence, a soothing white noise that lulled me to sleep every night. On my first night there, the familiar sounds were a comfort, but then I heard something new, faint, distant, and carried on the breeze. I heard a sound that was not natural to the wilderness. It was singing, a high, melodic, wordless tune, like a lullaby sung by an ancient, beautiful voice. It was strange, but I quickly rationalized it away. The acoustics of the canyon could do funny things to sound, and a late-night hiker on a distant ridge could be the source. The song was brief, and after a few moments, the gentle rushing of the river was the only sound again. I pulled my sleeping bag tight around me and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, a new memory of the song tucked away in the back of my mind. The next day was a perfect blur of fishing, hiking, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from being truly alone. I prepared my dinner, watched the sun dip below the jagged canyon walls, and let the familiar darkness settle in around me. As the first stars began to appear, the singing started again. This time, it wasn't a faint sound on the breeze. It was closer, much closer. It was coming from the river. I rose to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs, and stared out into the dark, flowing water. The song was no longer just a tune. It was a rhythmic, almost hypnotic chant, and it had a strange, beckoning quality to it. I shone my headlamp on the river, but all I saw was the water rushing over the rocks, the light glinting off the surface. But then I saw a shadow. A long, dark shape moved against the current, a silhouette that seemed to be flowing upstream, a feat that should have been impossible. It was a fleeting glimpse, a trick of the light and water, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down my spine. The singing continued, and I realized with a growing horror that the sound was not coming from down the river or up the river. It was coming from the river itself, from the water. My rational mind was screaming at me to pack up and leave, but I was frozen, mesmerized by the beautiful, terrifying melody. I watched the opposite riverbank, a sheer rock face that was impossible to climb, and saw another shape, a tall, thin silhouette that seemed to be watching me from a ledge far above. It was gone a moment later, a trick of my mind, I told myself. The singing, however, was no trick. It grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to walk towards the river. I had to force myself to turn away, to go back to the safety of my small campfire. The melody followed me, weaving its way through the sounds of the night. A beautiful alien sound that was slowly chipping away at my sanity, trying to lure me into its embrace. I sat by the fire for hours, my back to the river, my hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee, trying to drown out the sound of the singing with the sound of my own breathing. But I could still hear it. The woods have always been my sanctuary. I've been a hunter since I was a teenager, and the solitude of the deep forest is my church. I know these particular woods like the back of my hand, a sprawling national forest that sees little traffic. This trip was supposed to be a standard 2-day hunt, a quiet escape from the noise of the city. I was miles from the nearest trail, moving through a thicket of old-growth trees, when I found the first one. It was a single, small animal skull-eye. Think a raccoon perfectly clean and bleached white, with a bright red ribbon tied to a branch of a low-hanging tree. The ribbon was clean and new, the bow a perfect, symmetrical knot. I stood there for a moment, confused. This wasn't a marker, a prank, or a trail sign. It was simply wrong. The woods were a place of raw nature, of decay and rebirth. This was artifice. I untied the ribbon and left the skull on the ground, telling myself it was just a strange, isolated incident, probably the work of a bored teenager. The memory of it, however, stuck with me, an unsettling detail in an otherwise perfect day. As I continued on, the sun dipping lower in the sky, I found another one. This time, it was a deer jawbone, its teeth still in place, tied with a bright blue ribbon to a pine branch. It was just off the main path I was following, almost hidden, but in my direct line of sight. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. This wasn't a coincidence. This was deliberate. The woods, which had always felt so open and welcoming, now felt like a place I was being led through. My sense of direction, which had always been perfect, began to feel distorted. The trees looked the same. The paths all seemed to curve back on themselves, and I had the distinct, chilling feeling that I was no longer navigating the woods, but being guided by them. My mind tried to find a rational explanation, a new, strange, cultural practice, a group of artists, but the dread was too visceral, too real. That's when I started to hear the sound, a faint, low clicking, like bones knocking against each other, a rhythmic sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was so subtle that I initially thought it was just the rustling of leaves or the tapping of a woodpecker. But the rhythm was too perfect, too steady. It was the sound of a countdown, of something moving slowly, deliberately, toward an unknown destination. I finally decided to turn back to my cabin, but no matter which way I turned, I found myself facing another ribbon. They were now everywhere, each one a different color, each one tied to a different kind of bone, a collection of small vertebrae tied with a yellow ribbon, a femur with a pink one. The clicks grew louder, more insistent, a chilling soundtrack to my growing panic. I wasn't just finding the markers anymore, they were being placed for me. The trail of ribbons and bones led me deeper and deeper into a part of the forest I had never seen, a part that felt ancient and untouched. I ran. I abandoned my hunting gear, my rifle, everything. My only goal was to get back to my cabin, to the relative safety of a known place. The clicking sound was a constant, loud rhythm. Now, an unbearable sound that seemed to be coming from right behind me. I pushed through a thicket of brush and stumbled into a small, unnatural clearing. The ground was flat, packed dirt, not the usual soft moss and pine needles. In the center of the clearing, surrounded by a perfect circle of large, gray stones, was a figure. It was a doll, a large, crudely made effigy of a person, woven from sticks and branches, and bound together with twine. But its head was not a piece of wood. It was a human skull, bleached white, its empty eye sockets staring at me with a horrible, knowing emptiness. The clicking sound was deafening now, and I realized with a gut-wrenching horror that it was coming from the doll itself. I was transfixed, my feet rooted to the ground. Then, I saw its hands. They were holding a long, thin bone, and tied to one of its wrists was a familiar bright blue ribbon, the one I had seen on the jawbone earlier. I looked at the doll's head, at the empty eye sockets, and watched in a moment of pure, unadulterated terror as the skull slowly, silently, turned to face me, its gaze seeming to burn through me, to see all the way to my soul. I don't remember running from that clearing. I don't remember how I got back to the cabin. I just remember the feel of my lungs burning and the raw, scraping terror in my throat. I didn't stop until I was in my truck, driving down the gravel road, the sound of the clicking still ringing in my ears. I never went back to those woods. I sold all my hunting gear and haven't set foot in a forest since. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing the faint, rhythmic clicking of bones. I see the doll's head, slowly turning, and I know that I wasn't the one who found the markers in those woods. The markers found me, and the last one, the human skull tied to the doll, was a hint of what was coming next. The woods have always been my studio. For 20 years, I've made a living as a wildlife photographer, spending weeks at a time in the deepest, most remote forests to capture a single shot of a reclusive animal. The solitude is a necessity, a tool for my trade. On this particular expedition, I was in a rarely visited part of a national park, hunting for a glimpse of a rare gray owl. I was 2 days in, deep in the thickest part of the forest, when I saw it. It was a small, crudely built trap, a loop of knotted twine tied between two young saplings. What was unsettling wasn't the trap itself, but the bait. Tucked into the center of the loop was a small bundle of what looked like human hair, shiny and dark against the brown of the forest floor. The trap was empty, and the bait was clean. I took a few photos, a cold dread settling in my stomach. This was too strange to be a hunter's trap, and it was too deliberate to be accidental. It was a sign of a person who shouldn't have been in these woods, a person with a disturbing sense of what to leave behind. I told myself it was a poacher, or a strange survivalist with methods I didn't understand. I documented it and moved on, but I couldn't shake the image of that small, disturbing bundle. The next few days, I found more of them. The traps became more numerous and more elaborate, found in the thickest parts of the forest, always in places where an animal would naturally travel. One was a small pit covered with sticks and leaves, with a single, perfectly braided rope, made of what looked like gut or sinew, hanging over the edge. Another was a complicated series of knots and loops, tied with thin fibrous strands I couldn't identify. I stopped looking for animals and started looking for the traps. My original purpose forgotten. The woods, which had always felt so open and natural, now felt like a meticulously laid out maze, a carefully curated hunting ground. The silence, which had been a comfort, was now broken by a strange sound that seemed to follow me. It was a low, almost subsonic clicking, a hollow rhythmic sound that seemed to come from the trees themselves, a sound of wood and bone. It was subtle, but it was persistent, and it was everywhere. I started to feel like I was not just alone, but being watched, being followed. The woods felt less like a home for animals and more like a home for something else. I tried to set up a small camera trap, a standard motion-activated one, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was setting these things. I left it there for a day, and when I returned, I found it disassembled, its pieces scattered across the forest floor. The memory card was gone. In the wet mud nearby, I saw them footprints. They were small and impossibly long, bare footprints that stretched out, as if whatever made them had toes that bent and curled in a way that no human foot could. The clicks grew louder, and the fear turned from a cold dread into a hot, suffocating panic. I was back at my tent, the clicking sound a constant drumbeat in my ears, my mind racing. I had a single last resort camera, a high-tech model with a live video feed, and I decided to place it on a large, sturdy tree facing the direction I had seen the strange footprints. I turned it on, the screen showing me a live view of the dense forest, and huddled inside my tent, my heart pounding in my chest. The screen was just a static image of trees for what felt like an hour. Then, I heard a loud, sharp snap, and the live feed flickered. The camera's motion sensor had been tripped. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the screen, my eyes wide with terror. A figure moved through the trees, a blur of motion, impossibly fast and impossibly thin. It was human-like, but its limbs were long and spindly, bending at angles that defied physics. It moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, its movements a horrifying parody of a person walking. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its body was a dark, slender silhouette against the backdrop of the trees. The figure stopped, not more than 20 feet from the camera, and it turned. It turned its head, slowly and deliberately, and looked directly into the lens. It was then that I saw what it was holding. It was a small, braided rope, intricately woven with a disturbing precision. It was the shutter release cable from my first camera, the one that had gone missing. The figure then raised a single, long finger to its lips, a horrifying, silent gesture, as if to say she, and it looked not at the camera, but past it, directly at my tent, at me. I ran. I didn't stop to pack anything. I didn't grab my gear, my tent, my camera. I ran through the woods, the sound of the clicks fading behind me. The image of that thing burned into my mind. I eventually stumbled onto a main road, a total wreck, and flagged down a passing car. The authorities found no evidence. The camera and its memory card were gone. I never went back to the woods. I can't shake the image of that figure, its strange, impossible body, its silent, knowing gaze. The worst part, though, isn't the memory of the creature. It's the memory of that braided rope, a symbol of a mind that wasn't just hunting, but playing a game with me, a game that I had just lost. The terrifying thought that whatever was out there, it knew I was watching, and it wanted me to know that it was watching me, too. The woods behind my family's old farmhouse were my childhood kingdom. I knew every trail, every gully, every ancient oak tree. I've spent my entire life in those woods, and the deep, rich smell of the earth and the sound of the wind through the leaves are as familiar to me as my own reflection. This particular day, I was on a peaceful foraging trip, a hobby I've had since I was a kid. I was looking for morels and chanterelles, my head down, my senses attuned to the nuances of the forest floor. That's when I found it. It was a small, perfectly round hole, about the size of a coffee cup, dug into the soft earth, and sitting next to it, facing away from me, was a small, crudely made clay figurine of a human. It was primitive, with a bulbous head and a small, featureless body. The clay was a strange mixture of dark earth and something else, a reddish, almost fleshy color. It was dirty, as if it had just been pulled from the ground. I stared at it, my peaceful mood shattered. I knew every kid in this town, and none of them would be out here, this deep in the woods. It wasn't a prank. It was too isolated, too strange. I left it alone and continued on my way, trying to rationalize it as a forgotten toy or a strange bit of folk art. But the image of that dirty, featureless little figurine sitting next to that strange hole stayed with me, an unsettling stain on a place I had always considered sacred. As I moved deeper into the woods, the feeling of unease grew into a cold, hard dread. I started finding more of them, not just the one hole, but a series of them, each one a little larger, a little deeper than the last, and with each hole, a new figurine, each one more detailed and more disturbing than the one before. The second one was a small, lifelike rendition of a person's torso, with tiny, intricate ribs carved into the clay. The third one was a full body, with strange, long limbs and a head that was tilted to the side, as if listening. The clay was still that disturbing reddish-brown color, and the figures were always placed next to the hole, always facing away from me, as if they were watching something I couldn't see. The holes were not random. They were a path, a trail laid out with a sickening, deliberate purpose. My foraging trip was now a terrifying journey. I started to hear a faint scraping sound from beneath the ground, a sound of something moving in the earth itself. It was a wet, grating noise, and it seemed to come from all directions, an omnipresent presence that I couldn't escape. My childhood kingdom, my sanctuary, was now a place of profound and unnatural horror. I no longer felt like a forager. I felt like a trespasser, an interloper in a world I didn't understand. I decided to turn back, to get out of the woods. But when I turned around, I saw another hole, another figurine, right in the middle of the path I had just taken. They were not just a trail, they were a net, and I was trapped. I was running now, a primal fear driving me forward, away from the path of holes, trying to find a way out of the woods. The scraping sound was a constant presence, a wet, frantic digging that seemed to be coming from right under my feet. My panic, however, was a poor guide, and I found myself in a small hidden grotto I had never seen before. It was a clearing of moss and ferns, with an ancient oak tree in the center. In the middle of the grotto, I saw it, a large, freshly dug grave, a dark, gaping hole in the ground, and sitting on the edge of the grave was the last figurine, the largest one. It was a lifelike, detailed sculpture of a human, with every sinew and muscle group horribly represented in the clay. Its face was a work of art, a horrifyingly detailed, lifelike portrait of a person in a state of pure, primal agony. It wasn't a child's toy. It was a masterpiece of dread, and it was sitting on the edge of that grave, looking not at me, but at the empty space beside it. I realized with a gut-wrenching horror that the holes weren't meant for planting something, they were meant for something to come out of the ground. The scraping sound was deafening now, and it was coming from right beneath my feet, the sound of dirt and rock being pulled away by something relentless and powerful. The figurine on the edge of the grave was a portrait of the thing that was coming, a warning of what it was, and the grave was waiting for a body that was not its own. I ran from that grotto, my mind a blank slate of pure, unadulterated terror. I don't remember how I got out of the woods. I just remember the feeling of the ground trembling beneath my feet, and the sound of the scraping getting closer and closer. I stumbled out of the tree line hours later, a complete wreck, covered in mud and dirt, but alive. The police, when I finally calmed down enough to call them, found nothing. No grotto, no holes, no figurines, no grave. They chalked it up to a delusion, a panic attack brought on by a long day in the woods. I never went back into the woods behind my house. I sold the property and moved to a city, trying to put as much distance between myself and that feeling as I could, but I can't escape it. Sometimes, late at night, I feel a strange, cold presence under my bed, a sense of something patiently waiting, and I can't shake the image of that lifelike figurine and the terrifying thought that it was meant to be a portrait of the thing that was coming. There's a strange kind of peace that comes with hiking in thick fog. The world shrinks to a small, intimate circle around you, and everything else is a silent, white void. That's what I told myself, anyway, on a solo hike in a remote state forest, known for its deep, silent trails. I was about 5 miles in when I saw it, nailed to the trunk of an ancient oak tree, a small, hand-painted wooden sign. It was crudely made, the letters painted in a shaky black hand, but the message was starkly clear: don't look. My first thought was that it was a hiker's joke, a strange piece of trail art, or a reference to some local legend I hadn't heard. I laughed, a nervous, quiet sound that was swallowed by the silence of the fog. I took a photo of it with my phone, thinking it would make a good story later, and continued on my way. The feeling of quiet solitude now replaced by a small, prickly sense of unease. The fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to a mere 10 feet. The trail, once a clear path of packed dirt, was now a vague suggestion of where I was supposed to go. I started to hear sounds that shouldn't have been there. Faint, breathy whispers seemed to be carried on the humid air, coming from the trees themselves, just at the edge of the visible world. They were too quiet to make out, just a low, constant murmur that felt like a chorus of secrets. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind through the leaves, a common auditory illusion in a dense forest. But the wind was still. Then I started seeing things in the fog, fleeting movements at the periphery of my Vishuna, tall, thin, shadow that moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, a blur of motion that disappeared when I looked directly at it. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a side effect of the isolation. But then I found a second sign. This one was nailed to a thick branch, almost hidden from view. It was the same crude wood and shaky letters. This one said, "Don't stop." The whispers grew louder, and they started to make out words. The words were my name. They were my name, whispered over and over again, in a multitude of voices, some high and childlike, some low and guttural. The whispers were no longer coming from the trees. They were coming from the fog, and they were all around me. My casual hike had become a terrifying journey, a race against an unknown presence. The signs were no longer a joke. They were rules. A cold dread settled in my bones as I pushed myself to walk faster, to get out of the forest, to get away from the whispers and the shadows and the signs that were now scattered everywhere. Don't listen, don't breathe. Each new sign was a new rule, a new command that was meant to be followed. I ran blindly through the fog, pushing past branches and stumbling over roots. The whispers now a deafening chorus of my name. I felt like I was being herded, like I was following a path that had been meticulously laid out for me. My frantic flight led me to a small clearing, a strange, unnatural patch of ground where the fog seemed to have retreated. The clearing was bathed in a pale, ethereal light, the air still and silent, a terrifying contrast to the chaos I had just run from. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, impossibly old tree, its trunk thicker than a car, and on the trunk, at eye level, was the last sign. It was the same crude wood, the same shaky letters. It simply said, "Now." The whispers, which had been a chorus of voices, suddenly fell silent. The air was heavy with a profound and terrible quiet. The only sound was the thumping of my heart in my ears. I stood there, frozen with terror, my eyes fixed on the sign, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refusing to move. I thought about the first sign. Don't look. It was a command, a rule, a warning, and I had ignored it. A sickening curiosity, a terrifying, irresistible urge to see what was behind the curtain, took hold of me. I raised my head, my eyes moving, slowly from the sign, up the trunk of the massive tree, to see what was above it, and that's when I saw them. Wrapped around the back of the trunk, just above the sign, were two long, impossibly pale, multi-jointed fingers, their skin thin and wrinkled, their tips ending in sharp, black talons. The fingers were wrapped around the trunk, holding the sign in place, and as I watched, they slowly began to curl, their grip on the tree tightening, the sound of the wood creaking a low, horrible groan in the silent clearing. I don't remember what happened after that. I just remember running blindly through. The fog, the whispers gone, the only sound, the pounding of my feet on the forest floor. I stumbled onto a main road hours later, a total wreck, my clothes torn, my body covered in scrapes and bruises. I tried to tell the police what I had seen, but they found no signs, no clearing, no massive tree. They wrote it off as a delusion brought on by panic. I never went back to that forest. I don't go hiking anymore. I can't shake the image of those fingers and the horrifying, terrifying thought that the signs weren't meant to protect me. They were a set of rules, and I had broken the most important one. The last sign wasn't a joke. It was the end of the game, and I had looked at the thing that was holding the sign, and I know, with a chilling certainty, that it saw me. There are three of us, me, my best friend Marc, and his girlfriend, Jessica. We'd been planning this trip for months. A weekend of hiking and camping in a remote part of a national forest that was far enough from the main trails to feel truly wild. We had chosen a beautiful spot, a small clearing next to a winding creek, surrounded by towering pines. The first hour was a perfect montage of pitching tents, starting a fire, and cracking jokes. We were deep in the forest, miles from the nearest road, a feeling that usually brings a sense of freedom. But that feeling was shattered by a sound that came from the darkness beyond the firelight. It was a cry, a faint, distorted voice, calling for help. It was a high, terrified sound that was stretched and warped by the distance, but the message was clear. We all froze, our casual conversation dying in our throats. Marc, ever the pragmatist, shook his head. Probably another group of campers messing around. Jessica shivered. It sounded like a kid. The sound came again, a little closer this time, and we all knew it wasn't a joke. It was a horrifying, inhuman sound, a sound of a person in profound pain, and it was coming from the woods. We sat by the fire, our conversation now a quiet, tense murmur, our ears straining to hear the sound again. Our phones, we soon discovered, had no signal, a fact that had seemed like a good thing just an hour ago, but now felt like a prison. The cry for help came again, but this time, it was different. It sounded like Marc's voice, a terrified plea for help, coming from the darkness beyond the edge of our camp. Marc's face went white. "That's not me," he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Jessica started to cry. The voice came again, this time sounding like my father, his voice raw with panic, calling my name. I felt my blood run cold. It was impossible. He was at home, 100 miles away. The voice was a perfect imitation, but it was coming from the darkness, and it was a lie. The whispers and cries continued, a chorus of voices, all of them familiar, all of them begging for our help, begging for us to come out into the darkness and find them. We started to argue, our fear turning us against each other. Marc thought it was a prank, a group of sadistic campers who were trying to scare us. Jessica thought it was something else, something supernatural, something evil. I just sat there, listening, a cold dread settling over me. I saw fleeting shadows at the edge of the firelight, tall, thin silhouettes that disappeared when I looked directly at them. The cries for help were now a constant presence, coming from all directions, a terrifying symphony of familiar voices. We were completely isolated, and something out there knew who we were. It knew our fears. It knew our loved ones. It was a lure, a trap set with our own memories, and we were falling for it. The cries for help reached a fever pitch, a deafening chorus of our loved ones begging for us to come out. We were huddled in the center of our camp, our bodies pressed together, our eyes fixed on the darkness. I thought about the car, miles away. I thought about the nearest trail, a vague suggestion in the darkness. We were alone, and whatever was out there, it wasn't going away. The cries for help suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and terrible. It was a silence that meant the game was over. The lullaby had been sung, and the thing that was listening was now here. We heard a low, guttural growl, a wet, horrifying sound that came from the darkness just outside our tents. It was the sound of something hungry, something that was no longer pretending to be a voice from the past. A heavy thud hit the side of my tent, a violent, sickening impact that made the fabric groan. The growling intensified, a low, constant rumble that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. And then, we heard the sound of the tent flap. The zipper was slowly, deliberately, being unzipped from the outside. Jessica started to scream, a high, panicked sound that was swallowed by the growling. The zipper reached the end, and the flap was slowly pushed open. In the small, flickering light of the fire, we saw them, a pair of impossibly long, thin, pale hands, their fingers spindly and multi-jointed, reached inside. The hands were beckoning us, their long fingers slowly curling, a silent command for us to come out. The growling turned into a wet, clicking sound as if the thing was licking its lips, anticipating a meal. We didn't wait to see the rest of it. We ran blindly through the woods, our terrifying screams a testament to the horror we had just witnessed. We ran for hours, our bodies covered in scratches and bruises, our lungs burning, until we stumbled onto a main road, a total wreck. A passing car saw our terrified state and called for help. We were all treated for shock, but the doctors found nothing physically wrong with us. But the mental scars were deep and lasting. We never went back to that part of the forest. The image of those hands, their long, pale fingers beckoning us, is burned into our memories. The sound of that wet, clicking growl haunts our nightmares. The worst part, though, is the question that haunts us, a constant, nagging doubt that we can't escape. Was it really a cry for help we heard? Or was it a lure, a trap set by something that knew our deepest fears and our most precious memories? And were those hands reaching in to save us or to claim us? We'll never know. The forest in the autumn is a symphony of color and light. As a passionate amateur photographer, it's my favorite time to be in the woods. I was on a solo trip to a dense, secluded forest, miles from the nearest road, a place known for its vibrant foliage. The air was crisp and cool. The leaves were a fiery tapestry of reds and yellows, and the sun filtered through the canopy in a way that made the entire world feel like a painting. I found a perfect subject: an old, gnarled oak tree with twisted branches, its leaves a magnificent, deep crimson. I framed the shot, the composition perfect, and snapped the picture. I checked the photo on my camera's display, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the deep background, half hidden by a thicket of brush, was a figure, a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in old, tattered clothes. But what was most unsettling was his pose. He was standing perfectly still, his arms rigid at his sides, his body unnaturally straight, like a mannequin. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I quickly dismissed it. He was probably a fellow hiker I hadn't noticed. It was a strange pose, but people are weird. I deleted the photo, not wanting a stranger in my shot, and continued on my way, the peaceful solitude now tainted by the memory of that strange, unmoving figure. I continued to photograph, my mind trying to shake off the image of the man. I found a small stream. It surfaced a perfect mirror for the colorful trees overhead. I set up the shot, took a picture, and checked my camera. And there he was again, the figure, standing in the background, on the other side of the stream, his body rigid and still, a tall, gaunt silhouette against the vibrant foliage. This time he was farther away, but I knew it was the same man, the same unnaturally stiff pose. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I took another picture, just of the sky, but he was there, a distant figure in the corner of the frame. He was moving, I realized, but not like a person. He was moving with a silent, terrifying speed, always just outside my direct line of sight, appearing and disappearing in the background of my photos. I started to hear a sound that was not natural to the forest, a faint, dry whisper, like a dead leaf scraping against a tree trunk, a low, constant presence that seemed to be getting closer. My peaceful trip had become a terrifying game of cat and mouse, a race against a stalker who was everywhere at once. I started seeing him with my own eyes now, a tall, gaunt man in old, tattered clothes, his body rigid and unmoving, staring directly at me from a distance, just at the edge of my visible world. His face was a blank, hollow mask. The dry, scraping whisper was now a constant, chilling presence, and I realized that it was coming from the man himself, a sound of rustling skin and dry, rattling bones. The woods were no longer a beautiful place. They were a hunting ground, and I was the prey. My heart was pounding in my chest as I raced back to my car. The sound of the dry, scraping whisper, a constant presence behind me. I could feel his gaze on my back, a physical weight that made me stumble and fall. I finally made it to my car, a small, gray sedan, and fumbled for my keys. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get them out of my pocket. The figure was standing there, a few feet away from my car, just behind the driver's side. Door perfectly still, his body rigid, his blank, hollow face staring at me. I could see the tattered clothes, the gaunt and possibly thin body, the dry, leathery skin. I was so close to him, so close to the thing that had been stalking me, that I could smell him. It was a smell of old, dead leaves and dry, turned earth, a smell of decay and death. My mind was screaming at me to get in the car, to lock the door, to drive away, but I was frozen with a profound and terrible fear. I heard a voice. It wasn't a whisper. It was a dry, scraping, rattling voice, a sound of bones and leaves, and it came from right next to my ear. "Thank you for the pictures," it said. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head, slowly, my eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing there, just the air. But I felt something cold and hard and skeletal, traced the outline of my jaw, a single, long finger brushing against my skin. A terrible, final touch. I don't remember getting in the car. I don't remember driving away. I just remember the feel of that cold, skeletal finger on my face, and the sound of that dry, rattling voice in my ear. I drove 4 hours, not stopping until I was back in the city, surrounded by the noise and lights of civilization. The first thing I did was check my camera. The memory card was wiped clean. Every single photo I had taken was gone, but the memory of the figure and the feel of that cold, dead touch is burned into my mind forever. I still see him sometimes, in the periphery of my vision, a tall, gaunt figure, standing perfectly still, his body rigid, his blank, hollow face staring at me, and I still hear that dry, scraping whisper, and I know, with a horrifying certainty, that whatever was in that forest, it was not just a man. It was a thing that was waiting to be seen, and it wanted me to know that it had seen me, too. The night shift was my domain. For 5 years, I'd been the sole security guard for a massive 20-story corporate office building. I knew the place intimately, every echo in the marble lobby, every creak of the old elevator, every hum of the server room. The silence was my friend, a familiar blanket that made the endless hours feel peaceful. My routine was a soothing ritual, a patrol of every floor, a check of every lock, a final glance at the bank of security monitors in my small office. On a Tuesday night, during my final patrol of the 7th floor, I found something that didn't belong on the desk of a senior executive, a spotless mahogany expanse that I had checked just an hour before. There was a single, new file folder. It was a crisp, beige color, with a pristine label tab. My blood ran cold. The building was on lockdown, the doors sealed. No one was supposed to be here. I cautiously picked it up, my heart thudding in my chest. I opened it. It was completely empty. I told myself it was an oversight from the day shift, a forgotten file, a minor disruption to my perfect routine. I placed it in a nearby file cabinet and locked the drawer. The feeling of peaceful familiarity was gone, replaced by a cold, prickly sense of being observed. I went back to my office, the memory of the empty folder, a nagging thought in the back of my mind. On the security monitor, the hallways were still and silent, a network of empty corridors. I tried to focus on the routine, on the familiar hum of the server room, on the steady, rhythmic breathing of the building. But the silence now felt like a held breath, a moment of anticipation. I started my next patrol, my senses on high alert. I went to the 7th floor, my flashlight a small beacon in the oppressive darkness. I checked the file cabinet I had placed the folder in. It was still locked. I went to the senior executive's desk. The file folder was there, not where I had left it. It was sitting in the exact same spot as before, the pristine beige of the folder, a sickening highlight in the dark room. I opened it, my hands shaking. It wasn't empty this time. Tucked inside was a single, crisp sheet of paper. On it, drawn in a shaky, black ink, was a symbol I didn't recognize. It was a strange, intricate knot of lines and circles, a sigil of some kind, unsettling and alien. I slammed the folder shut, a wave of pure terror washing over me. This was not a prank. This was a message, and it was meant for me. I ran from the 7th floor, my breathing ragged and loud in the empty hallway, and took the stairs, not daring to wait for the old, groaning elevator. As I passed the 6th floor, I saw it, on the large white board in the main conference room, the same symbol, drawn in a shaky black marker. The lines and circles were there, staring at me, a silent, knowing presence. I ran down the stairs, faster and faster. A building that was once my home, now a terrifying labyrinth. My heart was pounding, and I could hear a new sound, the sound of the fluorescent lights. They were flickering in a strange, rhythmic pattern, a slow, deliberate cadence that seemed to be communicating something, a silent, blinking message from the building itself. I finally made it to my office, my body a coiled spring of tension. I looked at the security monitors. The hallways were empty, but there was a blur of movement on the 10th floor camera, a quick, fleeting shape that moved too fast to be human and too slow to be a trick of the camera. The feeling of being watched was no longer a feeling, it was a reality. I tried to contact my supervisor on the radio, but all I got was static, a low garbled hiss that was a perfect, sickening white noise. The landline was dead. I was trapped. I knew I had to get to the server room, the heart of the building, to re-establish communications. I grabbed my flashlight and a baseball bat I kept under my desk and moved out into the lobby. The sound of my own footsteps, a lonely, terrified echo. The power was now flickering everywhere, the low hum of the fluorescent lights, a chorus of unsettling sound. I made my way to the server room, a large cold room on the sub-basement floor, a place where the building's digital brain was housed. I unlocked the heavy door and stepped inside, the cold air a sharp contrast to my sweaty skin. The hum of the servers was a powerful, rhythmic beat, a sound of life and technology. As I reached for the main console, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the air ducts above me. It was a slow, deliberate sound, a tap tap tap, a code. I held my breath, my entire body rigid, my eyes fixed on the air duct above my head. The tapping began to spell out a word in Morse code, a word I knew from my time in the military. HLP, help. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and terrible. Then, I heard a new sound, a slow, metallic scraping, and the ceiling panel above me, the one that covered the air duct, slowly began to creak open. I watched, horrified, as the small, dark space above was revealed. A thin, pale hand, with long, unnaturally jointed fingers, slowly reached down from the darkness, its fingers beckoning, a silent, horrifying command for me to come closer. The tapping stopped and was replaced by a wet, clicking sound, a sound of a tongue against the roof of a mouth, a sound of hunger and anticipation. I ran. I didn't wait to see the rest of it. I ran out of the server room, out of the basement, and into a small, windowless office on the first floor. I locked the door, pushed a heavy desk in front of it, and huddled in the corner, a trembling, terrified wreck. I stayed there, listening to the silence of the building, for what felt like an eternity. The day shift found me there, a pale, shaking mess, when they arrived at dawn. The authorities found nothing. The 7th floor was pristine, the senior executive's desk was empty, and the whiteboard in the conference room was clean. The server room was exactly as it should have been, the ceiling panel shut tight, with no sign of a hand, or a tapping sound, or a hunger. I never worked another night shift again, but I can't shake the memory of that hand, its long, thin fingers, beckoning me, and the chilling thought that the silence of the empty building wasn't empty at all. It was just waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The city library was my second home. As the late-night archivist, I was responsible for digitizing the library's vast collection of historical records. A quiet, solitary job that I adored. My shifts began at 10 p.m., after the last patron had left and the heavy oak doors were locked. The building, an old, sprawling labyrinth of stories and secrets, was my sanctuary. I knew every dusty corner, every whisper of the air conditioning, every groan of the old wooden floors. My favorite part of the job was the solitude, the feeling of being the only living soul in a building filled with millions of stories. One particularly quiet night, While I was working on a collection of 19th century maps, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic thud, like a book being dropped on the floor. It came from the 5th floor, the locked, historical manuscripts section, a place where I was the only person with a key. I froze, my hand hovering over the scanner. I told myself it was an old book shifting on a shelf, a quirk of the ancient building. I told myself it was my imagination. It was nothing. But the silence that followed felt heavy and expectant. A moment of profound dread that was a complete antithesis to the comfort I had always felt in this place. I tried to shake it off, to go back to my work, but the silence of the library had changed. It was no longer a peaceful presence. It was a listening presence. I went back to my work, but I was now listening. And then I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a thud. It was a soft, deliberate sound, a rhythmic slide of a book across the floor, followed by the soft, rustling sound of a page being turned. The sounds were always from the 5th floor, the locked floor. I told myself it was a mouse, a rat, anything that could make a sound that wasn't human. But the sound of a page being turned was too deliberate, too knowing to be a rodent. The fear started to turn into a terrifying, morbid curiosity. I had to know what was on that floor. I took my flashlight and the master key and made my way up the winding, silent stairs, each creak of the old wood an exclamation point to my growing panic. I unlocked the heavy metal barred door of the 5th floor and stepped inside, the dusty, era cold, shocking contrast to the warmth of the lower floors. The hallway stretched out before me, a long, dark corridor of books. The silence was absolute. My flashlight cut a small, trembling cone of light through the darkness. The books on the shelves, thousands of them, were all facing outward, their spines a silent, watchful audience. But one book, on a small, secluded shelf, was turned to face inward, its spine a blank space in the endless sea of titles. I approached it, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I heard the sound again, the soft, deliberate rustle of a page being turned. It was coming from right behind the book. I reached out, my hand shaking, and pulled the book out. Behind it, in the small, empty space on the shelf, there was nothing. The sound of the page turning came again, this time from the hallway, from a distance, from a place where I was sure there was no one. The books on the shelves, I noticed, were now not in their correct order. A strange trail of books, each one an obscure, forgotten title, was laid out on the floor, leading to a small, hidden corner of the floor I had never seen before, a place where a thick, dusty curtain hung from the ceiling, hiding something from view. I followed the trail of books, my flashlight beam a trembling, terrified finger pointing the way. The rustle of the pages, the rhythmic turning of the paper, was now a constant presence. A sound that filled the air, a sound of a story being told, a story that was just for me. I reached the curtain and pulled it back. The dusty fabric a soft, choking presence in the air. Behind it was a small, hidden room, a reading room I had never seen before. It was a small, circular room with a single, massive oak table in the center, a table that had a single book on it, a large, dusty, leather-bound tome. The book was open, its pages a shocking, pristine white against the dark wood of the table. They were blank. The book was a story that had never been written, but as I stared at the blank pages, I saw it. A small, dark shadow, a blot of ink on the pristine white, slowly started to move across the page. It began to grow, its edges becoming sharp and defined, its shape changing, becoming more and more human. It was a silent, black silhouette, a man made of ink and shadow, a man who was now standing, rising from the pages of the book, a terrifying presence against the white. The man made of shadow slowly turned his head, his face a hollow, empty void, and he stared directly at me. He raised a long, dark arm, its fingers elongated and thin, and with a horrifying, silent gesture, He beckoned me to come closer, to come and read his story. I ran. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to scream. I ran out of the reading room, out of the 5th floor, and out of the library, leaving my keys, my work, and my sanity behind. I called the authorities, a hysterical, rambling mess, but they found nothing. The 5th floor was empty. The books were all in their correct place, and the small hidden reading room was gone. The space behind the curtain, a solid brick wall. The librarian on the morning shift told me the building had no such room. I never went back. I can't shake the memory of that empty book, and the terrifying, cold thought that some stories are not meant to be read, but to be born, and that I was the only person who had been there to see it happen. I've been a janitor for over 30 years, and the graveyard shift is my preferred time to work. The quiet, the solitude, the feeling of being the last person left in the world, it's all a calming presence in my life. This particular job, however, was different. I was working the night shift at an old abandoned elementary school that was being prepped for demolition. It was a dusty, silent place, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten children's laughter. My job was simple: clean it out, sweep away the dust of memory. I was in an old classroom, a small room with faded wallpaper and a single, massive chalkboard. When I found it, the chalkboard had been wiped clean moments before, a pristine, black expanse. But in the center, drawn in a shaky white hand, was a child's drawing. It was a crude stick figure, but its limbs were long and spindly, its body a thin, fragile line. The figure was standing alone, in the middle of a blank space. My blood ran cold, but I dismissed it as a prank. Kids had been sneaking in for years. I grabbed my eraser and wiped it clean, leaving the chalkboard a black, blank canvas again. But the image of that long, spindly stick figure stayed with me, an unsettling stain on a place that was supposed to be empty. As I continued my work, the silence of the school began to feel different. It was no longer a peaceful presence. It was a listening presence. I went to the next classroom, a large, sprawling space with 2 blackboards. The first one was clean. The second one had a drawing on it, the same stick figure, but this time it was larger and more detailed. It had a crude, smiling face, and its long, spindly fingers were holding something I couldn't make out. The fear turned from a cold dread into a hot, suffocating panic. This wasn't a prank. There was no one in the school but me. I ran from the classroom, my heart pounding in my chest, and made my way to the next hallway. I heard a sound from the end of the long, dark corridor. It was a faint, high-pitched giggle, a small, childlike sound that was both innocent and profoundly evil. It came from an open classroom door, a door that had been shut moments before. I stood there, frozen, my body a coiled spring of terror. The giggle came again, a little closer this time. The lights in the hallway, which had been a steady, humming presence, began to flicker. A quick rhythmic blinking that seemed to be communicating something, a silent message from the building itself. I started to notice a strange, cold presence following me. A presence that felt small and childlike, but with a malevolent twist. A feeling of an old, steep hatred that was trapped in this building. I went to the next classroom, and the drawing was there again. This time, it was on the floor, in a patch of dust. A massive, crude drawing of the stick figure, with a small, smiling face and long, spindly fingers. The drawings were no longer just drawings. They were a story, a terrifying, animated narrative of something that was trapped in this school. My terror was now a constant, physical presence. I was running from classroom to classroom, a terrified prisoner in a labyrinth of my own making, trying to find an escape. The giggling was now a chorus of voices, 1,000 small, hype sounds of laughter, all of them directed at me. The drawings were everywhere now, a wall of crude, smiling stick figures with long, spindly limbs, a silent, mocking presence. I finally ran to the school's old gymnasium, a large, dark, echoing space that felt like a sanctuary from the claustrophobia of the classrooms. I stood in the center, my flashlight beam, a trembling, dancing finger of light, trying to catch my breath. The giggling stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and terrible. I heard a new sound, a slow rhythmic tapping, coming from inside the wall, right where the drawing's chest would be. The tapping intensified, a quick, insistent cadence that was impossible to mistake. I looked at the wall, a vast, white expanse of plaster, and saw it. The same stick-figure drawing was there, a massive, crude drawing of a man with long, spindly limbs, its fingers splayed out on the wall, its head tilted to the side. The tapping intensified, and the drawing began to peel away from the wall, the paper and chalk a horrible, scraping sound. A small, stick-like hand, its fingers long and spindly, pushed out from the wall. A terrifying, silent, beckoning gesture. The giggling was back, a chorus of high-pitched sounds of pure, unadulterated joy. I don't remember what happened after that. I just remember the feel of my lungs burning and the raw, scraping terror in my throat. I ran from the gym, out of the school, and locked myself in a small utility closet until dawn. The demolition crew found me there, a pale, shaking mess, when they arrived in the morning. They found no drawings, no open doors, and the gym wall was a solid, unblemished expanse of plaster. I never worked another night shift again, but I can't shake the memory of that drawing and the terrifying cold thought that some stories are not just in the imagination. Some stories are trapped, waiting for the right moment to come out. The night shift in a hospital is a strange and silent world. As a veteran janitor, I'd spent the last 20 years in the quiet, echoing hallways of St. Jude's, a massive aging hospital in the heart of the city. The graveyard shift was my domain. I knew the rhythm of the place, the hushed footfalls of the nurses, the distant beeping of machines, the low hum of the life support systems. My rounds were a meditation, a silent walk through a world of life and death. The most unsettling part of my job was the pediatric wing. It had been shut down for years, a dark, forgotten space on the third floor that was only ever opened for my monthly inspection and cleaning. One night, as I was pushing my cart through the silent, empty hallway of the abandoned wing, I saw it. A single patient's wristband, a small plastic band with a child's name written on it, was lying on the freshly cleaned floor. It was pristine, a bright new color against the dull, institutional tile. I froze, my hand on the handle of my cart. No one had been in this wing in years. I told myself it was an old relic that had fallen out of a forgotten box, a ghost of a past life. I picked it up, my fingers trembling, and threw it in the trash. The building was on lockdown, the doors sealed. No one was supposed to be here, but the feeling of peace was gone, replaced by a cold, prickly sense of being observed. I finished my work in the pediatric wing and went back to the lower floors. But the memory of that wristband, so new and so clean, was a nagging thought in the back of my mind. I was sweeping the floors of the maternity ward, the low hum of the life support systems a constant, soothing presence, when I found another one. A single patient's wristband, this one, a different color, was lying in the middle of the floor, a bright new presence against the clean tile. I picked it up, my heart thudding in my chest. This was not a coincidence. This was deliberate. I threw it away again, a sense of a profound and terrible dread washing over me. I started to hear a new sound, a sound that was not the building, settling, not the hum of the machines. It was a soft, wet, tapping sound, A small, rhythmic noise that seemed to be coming from the floor above me, from the empty pediatric wing. It was the sound of a small, bare foot on a tiled floor, a quick, light tapping that was both innocent and deeply unsettling. I ran up the stairs to the 3rd floor, my flashlight beam a trembling, terrified finger of light. The tapping stopped the moment I arrived. The hallway was silent, empty. My flashlight fell on the wall, and I saw it. Taped to the wall was a small, hand-drawn picture. It was a crude drawing of a stick figure, a small, childlike shape, holding a red balloon. My breath caught in my throat. This was not a prank. The wristbands and the drawings were a trail, a path laid out for me. The taps came again, this time from the hallway on my right, from a place where there was a long, dark corridor of empty rooms. The sound was getting louder, more insistent, a frantic, rhythmic tapping that was a clear, unmistakable demand. I started to see a fleeting movement in the periphery of my vision, a small, childlike shape that disappeared when I looked at it. A blur of motion that was a silent, taunting presence. I knew, with a horrifying certainty, that I was not alone. I was back in the empty pediatric wing, drawn there by a terrible, morbid curiosity, a compulsion to know what was in this place. The tapping was now a frantic, excited rhythm, 100 small bare feet tapping against the walls, the floors, the ceiling. The hallway was a terrifying labyrinth of sound and darkness, a place where 1,000 children were playing a terrible game. I saw a single drawing on the back wall of a long, dark hallway, a massive, crude drawing of a stick figure, its long, spindly limbs reaching out from the center of the wall, its face a grotesque, horrifying smile. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and terrible. I heard a new sound, a slow, rhythmic scratching, coming from inside the wall, right where the drawing's chest was. The scratching intensified, a quick, insistent cadence. That was impossible to mistake. The drawing began to peel away from the wall. The paper and chalk, a horrible scraping sound. A small skeletal hand, its fingers long and spindly, reached out from the wall. The tapping started again, this time from inside the walls. 100, 1,000, small, bare feet tapping against the walls. All of them trying to get out, all of them trying to get to me. The scratching sound intensified, and the drawing began to rip away from the wall. The sound of tearing paper, a horrifying symphony of pain and longing. I ran. I didn't wait to see the rest of it. I ran out of the pediatric wing, out of the 3rd floor, and locked myself in a small utility closet on the 1st floor. I stayed there, a pale, shaking mess, until the morning shift found me. They found no drawings, no open doors, and the wall in the pediatric wing was a solid, unblemished expanse of plaster. I never worked another night shift again, but I can't shake the memory of that drawing, and the terrifying thought that the hospital wasn't just a place of death and healing. It was a place where some stories are trapped, waiting for the right moment to come out. The overnight shift at a rural 911 dispatch center is a lonely, quiet world. The calls are few and far between, a mix of late-night fender benders, domestic disputes, and the occasional lost hiker. I've been a dispatcher for 15 years, and I know the rhythm of the night, the voices of the locals, the familiar sounds of a town asleep. The quiet allows me to focus, to be a calm, steady presence in the chaos of a midnight emergency. One night, a little after 2 a.m., I received a call that broke the rhythm. The caller ID was a landline from an old, forgotten part of the county, a line that had been disconnected for years. I answered it, expecting static or a hang-up, but all I heard was silence. Not the dead air of a disconnected line, but the heavy, expectant silence of an open one. and in the background of the dead line, I heard a sound. A strange, faint, rhythmic clicking. A steady, hypnotic beat that sounded like a cheap, plastic toy. It was unsettling, but I dismissed it. A kid playing with a disconnected phone. A prank call. I cleared the line and moved on. The quiet returned, but the sound of that rhythmic clicking stayed with me, an unsettling ghost in the silence of the night. The next call came in less than an hour later. It was the same caller ID, the same disconnected landline. I answered it, my heart thumping in my chest. Silence, and the rhythmic clicking. Louder and more distinct this time, a precise, methodical beat that was now impossible to mistake for a child's toy. The sound of the clicking was now joined by a new sound, a faint, distorted voice, a high, childlike melody that sounded like a nursery rhyme being sung just out of earshot. The voice was warped and alien, a chilling, inhuman presence that was being broadcast over the dead line. I checked the caller ID again, and my blood ran cold. The calls were all coming from different, disconnected landlines, all of them in a very specific, remote part of the county, an old, forgotten section of the woods that was known for strange disappearances. The clicking sound started to sound like it was coming from inside the call center itself, a strange, phantom noise that seemed to follow me, a sound that was now in my head, a rhythmic, maddening beat that was a constant, unsettling presence in the silence of the night. I tried to call the local police to tell them about the strange calls, but all the lines were busy. Every single one of them. A cold, suffocating dread washed over me as I realized the calls weren't just coming to me. They were a signal, a lure, and I was trapped. The silent calls were now a constant, unrelenting presence. My console was lit up with 100 different calls, all of them from disconnected lines, all of them filled with the same rhythmic clicking and the same distorted, childlike nursery rhyme. The sound was deafening, a symphony of pure, unadulterated horror. The clicking was no longer a phantom sound. It was a real, physical presence, a sound that was now in the room with me, a sound that was coming from the darkness beyond the glow of my console. I saw a fleeting movement in the corner of my eye, a small, childlike shape that disappeared when I looked directly at it. I was in a state of catatonic terror, my body a block of ice, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet refusing to move. I finally broke free of my paralysis and ran to the main server room, the heart of the dispatch center, hoping to find a way to trace the calls, to find a way to get out. The clicking was deafening now, a sound of wood and plastic, a sound of a toy being played with. I turned the corner and saw it. The figure, it was a small, childlike shape, a silent, motionless silhouette against the white glow of the servers. But its limbs were long and spindly, its body impossibly thin, and its head was tilted to the side, as if listening. The figure was holding a toy, a small, plastic music box. And the nursery rhyme, the chilling, distorted melody, was coming from the toy itself. I watched, frozen with terror, as the figure slowly raised the toy to its head and put the music box to its ear. The music stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and terrible. The figure slowly turned its head, its empty face staring directly at me, and it slowly raised a single, long, spindly finger to its lips. A horrifying, silent gesture, as if to say, "She." I ran. I didn't wait to see the rest of it. I ran out of the server room, out of the dispatch center, and into the night. I ran for hours, my lungs burning, my mind a blank slate of pure, unadulterated terror, until I stumbled into a gas station. The police, when I finally calmed down enough to call them, found nothing. The call center was silent and empty. The phones were all in working order, and the phantom calls were gone. I never worked the night shift again, but I can't shake the memory of that figure, and the terrifying, cold thought that the night shift wasn't just a job. It was a place where a silent, patient hunter was waiting for a sound to make its move. The factory was my graveyard, and I was its only living resident. My job was to monitor a handful of archaic machines on the night shift, a job that was more about being a silent, watchful presence than a hands-on mechanic. The factory was an enormous, cold, echoing space, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten workers and the rhythmic, hypnotic hum of the machines. The solitude was a comfort, a peaceful, meditative time in a world that was always too loud. One night, while I was doing my rounds, I stopped to admire the polished, mirror-like surface of a massive metal press. I was admiring the reflection of the empty factory, the long dark corridor of machines, when I saw it. A figure. A man was standing directly behind me, a tall, gaunt silhouette in the polished metal, his arms rigid at his sides, his face a blank, hollow mask. My heart stopped. I spun around, my flashlight a trembling, dancing finger of light, but there was nothing there, just the cold, empty factory floor and the rhythmic, hypnotic hum of the machines. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by the long hours and the solitude. The reflection had been a ghost, a remnant of my imagination. I chalked it up to a tired mind and continued my work, but the peaceful solitude was gone, replaced by a cold, prickly sense of unease. The feeling of unease grew into a cold, hard dread. The reflections started to become more frequent, more distinct. I saw the figure in the polished metal of more machines, in the dark, grimy glass of the windows, in the small, reflective puddles on the floor. He was always in the background, always a tall, gaunt silhouette with a blank, hollow face, and he was always watching me. He never moved when I looked at him, but I knew he was there. I started to hear a new sound, a strange, low, rhythmic, metallic tapping, a sound of something moving in a slow, methodical way, a sound that was coming from the machines themselves. The machines, which had always been a comforting presence, now felt like a silent, watchful audience, 100 metallic eyes that were all watching me. The tapping sound was getting closer, and I realized that the tapping was a signal, a message from the machines, a countdown to something I didn't want to know. The figure was in every reflection now, a constant, horrifying presence that was everywhere at once. I tried to call for help, but the radio was full of static, a low, garbled hiss that was a perfect, sickening white noise. The landline was dead. I was trapped in a cold, metal world, and the silent, watchful audience was all around me. I ran from machine to machine, my mind a blank slate of pure, unadulterated terror, trying to find an escape. The tapping was now deafening, a symphony of metal and bone, a sound of something trying to get out. I finally made it to the main control room, a small, glass-walled room in the center of the factory, a place where I was supposed to be safe. I was trying to shut down the machines, to turn off the rhythmic, hypnotic hum, to stop the tapping, to silence the world that was trying to tell me a horrifying story. The tapping was deafening now, and I saw the figure. Not a reflection this time. He was standing directly behind me, a tall, gaunt man with a blank, hollow face. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and terrible. I heard a voice, not a whisper, but a dry, scraping, rattling voice, a sound of metal and bone, a sound of something that had been waiting for a very long time. The voice came from right next to my ear. "You can't turn us off," it said. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head, slowly, my eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing there. Just the air. But I felt something cold and skeletal traced the outline of my jaw, a single, long, thin finger brushing against my skin, a terrible, final touch. The lights in the control room all went out at once, leaving me in total darkness. I heard a low, guttural growl and the sound of 100 machines starting up at once. Their rhythmic tapping, a terrifying symphony of noise, a sound of 1,000 voices laughing at me, A sound of 1,000 stories being told. A sound of 1,000 machines coming to life. I don't remember what happened after that. I just remember the feel of that cold, skeletal finger on my face, and the sound of that dry, rattling voice in my ear. I ran from the control room, out of the factory, and locked myself in a small utility closet until dawn. The morning shift found me there, a pale, shaking mess. The machines were all in working order. The control room was silent and empty, and the factory was a quiet, empty space. I never worked another night shift again, but I can't shake the memory of that reflection, and the terrifying, cold thought that the night shift wasn't just a job. It was a place where a silent, patient hunter was waiting for a sound to make its move.